The rains of early April here in western Tennessee slowed Albert Sidney Johnston's Confederate army at times to a crawl as they marched north out of Corinth. What was supposed to be a surprise attack on unsuspecting Union forces on April 4th became impossible. His inexperienced men, who were concerned that their guns wouldn't fire because of all the rain, would occasionally fire random shots into the air. If you were trying to make a surprise attack on the Union Army, this was not the way to do it. But despite all of that, when Johnston's army finally arrived in position on the afternoon of April 5th, it seems they still held the element of surprise. His senior commanders, including General Beauregard and Hardee and Bragg, all insisted that the element of surprise had been lost, that they should call off the attack and return to Corinth. But Johnston was determined to make the attack. Now, on the Union side, the senior commanders remained unconvinced that there was any threat from the Confederate Army. It fell then to a obscure, otherwise relatively unknown colonel to make the right call. His name was Everett Peabody, and concerned about the reports of Confederate activity to his front, his brigade being one of the ones in Prentice's division that made the southern boundary of the Union encampment, he decided early in the morning hours after midnight on April 6th to send out a patrol of about 250 men well in advance to the south of the Union picket line. And they were in this area just behind me, an area known as Fraley Field, at around 4:55 in the morning when 3 pistol shots rang out. They were the first shots fired in the Battle of Shiloh. As the Union patrol was setting out to try and locate Confederate forces, General Johnston was sitting listening to his senior commanders continue to argue against any sort of an attack at all. But Johnston's position was that the Union, no matter how many there were, could only put so many men on the front between the Tennessee River and Owl Creek. And so he believed they would just be stacked up if they had more men. And he said, if they have more men, that's just more men for us to pour heat onto. He said, I will attack even if there's 1 million of them. And as he continued to listen to his men, his senior commanders argue, the shots that signaled the start of the Battle of Shiloh rang out. He heard those shots, and he heard the skirmishing that began between Hardcastle's Mississippians and Powell's Missourians. He climbed up on his horse, he looked at his men, and he said, tonight we water our horses in the Tennessee River. And he rode off to the front. The Union forces that made up that patrol were companies B, E, and H of the 25th Missouri Infantry. They were under command of Major James Powell. And when those shots were fired by the Confederates, and the Confederates were under command of a man named Major Aaron Hardcastle. He was from Mississippi, and he commanded the pickets that were in advance of a massive Confederate force that was emerging from those woods. Hardcastle was right along that ridge in the distance. There would have been some buildings over there in the corner for the Fraley farm. And so Major Powell lined his 250 men up right along these woods right here, and they began to skirmish with Hardcastle's Mississippians in this field. And you would think, with Hardcastle in front of a massive advance of thousands and thousands of Confederates, that it would have been very quickly apparent for Major Powell, to pull his men out of there, because the Union actually had strict orders that if they encountered Confederate forces, they were to fall back to their camp. That under no circumstances were they to bring on a major battle, because they needed to wait for Buell's army to arrive. So that's not what happened. It's just one of many times on this day that the Union forces fought and fought well and slowed what was supposed to be a rapid Confederate frontal assault to a crawl. The men of James Powell's 3 companies held this field for about an hour before they were forced to fall back. Not every person with a famous story was a general or a high-ranking officer here at Shiloh. There were privates that went on to do some pretty big things too, and one of them was a private in Company E of the 6th Arkansas Infantry, who was a part of Hardee's attack. His name was Private Henry Morton Stanley, and about a decade after the events of the Battle of Shiloh, he would be in Central Africa looking for a missionary by the name of Dr. David Livingston. And Stanley, when he found and resupplied Livingston, very famously uttered words, "Dr. Livingston, I presume." Well, on the morning of April 6, 1862, Henry Morton Stanley was here fighting in the Confederate attack. We're now looking north from about the center left of Hardee's division's position as they pressed toward the Union lines. When the fighting began, it was immediately obvious to the divisions of Sherman and Prentiss, who were on the southern end of the battlefield, what was going on. And so they began to hastily organize a defense. And Prentiss organized his defense on the ridge that we see in front of us. It was south of his camp. So his tents would have been behind him. And they held there for about an hour along this ridge. Spain Field would be off in that direction over there. But eventually the 9,000 men of Hardee's corps were just too much for the 6,000 men of Prentiss to be able to hold. At around 6 a.m., Johnston finally ordered his attack to move forward, and the scouting party was forced to fall back, and they joined the remainder of the 25th Missouri and the other units in Peabody's brigade in fighting a delaying action. Now, that brigade and the others beside it were up against a force of about 9,300 men under Hardee, who were coming down that road in this direction. Behind them, another 23,000 men under Polk and Bragg were advancing. But Peabody put up a strong defense until eventually they were forced to fall all the way back here to where their original encampment had been for the previous few weeks. So here we see the sign that indicates that this is the camp of the 25th Missouri. By about 9 o'clock in the morning on April 6th, the 25th had, or what was left of the 25th, fell back here to their original encampment site. Now on the morning of April 6th, if you would have been here, what you would have seen would have been these massive teepee-like tents that dotted this area. They weren't little two-man like pup tents. These were Sibley tents that had been designed after Indian teepees. They had a pole in the middle, and they were 18 feet around, and they could hold comfortably a dozen men, but in a pinch they could hold up to 20 men under one of these. And they had all of the men's supplies. They had been camped here for 3 weeks. They were comfortable. They had their stuff kind of out. They weren't expecting to fight. And so while the remnants of the 25th tried to hold on here right around the headquarters of Colonel Peabody, the Confederates stumbled upon this location and it caused them to stop. Remember, these guys had been advancing through the rain, through the mud. They were inexperienced. They had a lack of discipline. And when they encountered these Sibley Tents of the 25th Missouri, all command and control broke down. And the Confederates started looting the tents. And it took a considerable amount of time for their officers to reorganize the men, to get them back into lines of battle so that they could continue the attack. And like so many things on the day, the first day of the battle, that bought time for the Union to form their defensive positions. The actions taken on the morning of April 6 by Colonel Peabody could have led to discipline, including a court-martial. He had done that without orders, without authorization, and in fact had continued to fight despite direct orders not to bring on a general engagement. The fact is, we'll never know what might have happened, because at around 9 a.m., as he was continuing to organize and direct the defense here at his headquarters, Colonel Peabody was killed leading his troops. As for Major James Powell, whose 3 companies had fired the first Union shots of the battle as he led that patrol that Peabody had ordered, he too fell on the field this day, wounded at least 11 times.